I want to thank our friends over at Deepwater Wind for all their support. We have cha-ching. This is no Bitcoin fiscal expert. This is the real deal. Cold, hard, greenback Gary Sasse. Welcome, Moneyman.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to see you. Did you, you're one of those smart guys. Did you have money on the game last night?
I did okay last night.
You did okay last night.
No, not a lot, but I picked teams I root for by how many brothers from the No Brotherhood play for them. And Philadelphia had 4 or 5, so that was not a hard choice.
And this is a big winning. Will we have a major expansion of the Sasse empire as a result of the winnings?
No, the winnings probably are worth 2 six-packs.
2 6-packs, that's great. And hopefully next Monday you have consumed both of them before you come on air.
I did before I came.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk, lots to cover today. Let's talk a little bit about what is starting to emerge as a significant issue, which is this need by Governor Raimondo to build this $1 billion package, and the new spending is $250 million. We talked a little bit about this previously. She's also got some others on the wish list. It looks to be around $350, $400 million of general obligation bonds that'll go before the voters in November. That's a much higher number than in my 30 years that we've seen on that.
Well, let's break it out. There's $250 million for school,
Yep.
elementary and secondary school repair modernization. There's about another $70 million for URI and for Rick, one for the Narragansett Bay campus and one to refix the Horace Mann building. And there's about another 45 or 50 million for environmental projects, for green projects.
Right.
So that totals about $370 million. And so the question becomes, what can we afford? There was a report that was issued by the General Treasurer a few months ago, and he said we could afford more debt, but the number he pegged it at, which I think is high, but was about $220 million of debt in 19, and another $1.2 billion of debt over the 10-year period. So if the General Treasurer's estimate was good, and it was a reasonable estimate, I would reduce it by about 10-15%, so I wasn't spending all my capacity. I left a little bit of a cushion, but if you reduce it by 10% or you accept the General Treasurer's numbers, then what we can afford
is 200 million
Yeah,
per cycle.
right, which seems a little bit closer to traditionally what we've
Yeah.
done. And so I think the legislature is in a position when they look at the debt numbers, when they look at the measurements, and we do have good measurements of debt capacity and debt affordability. When they look at those measurements, they'll probably need to work and trim down the governor's proposal closer to 200 million than to 370 million.
So if you're over, let's talk about this on 2 levels. If you're over at the General Assembly, you kind of like the idea of doing schools in your community, but really the only new spending is the proposed bonding. At $150 million on that doesn't get you too far.
Well, keep in mind the
2 middle schools?
No, keep in mind that $250 million was a 5-year program.
Yeah.
That money wasn't going to be spent in 1 year. And also keep in mind that the Department of Education RIDE was going to have a priority list, and this was to talk about safe, warm, schools that met basic environmental standards, and they would pick from the list. So, if it was roofs, it was replacing windows, replacing heating systems. In some cases, a facility, you could manage that money. So the question becomes, if the $250 million was for a 5-year program, what's the difference in getting authorization of $150 million for a 3-year program and then coming back for more when you look at your debt margins and your debt capacity?
But if I use your math correctly and the General Treasurer's math appropriately, you're really talking about this is what you can afford. There's not going to be any huge windfall in the future. I mean, we've talked enough about what the long-term projections are, and Mike DeBiase was here last week. He said, de facto, when you break it down, we've got a spending issue.
That's totally a spending issue. We've got a structural deficit issue, but there are specific metrics that we can measure debt with. We look at debt service in relation to general revenue. And we know what the rating agencies do, we know what the standards are, that if your debt service exceeds 7% of your own source revenue, that's too much. We're about 6% now, but trending up to about 6.5%. So we're taking that about as far as we can.
But let me jump in here. We're talking about fixing roofs and fixing windows. Aren't we now at a stage, you go and look at Massachusetts new schools, rehab schools, they're smart schools. There's technology dripping from the ceilings. And we're talking about taking middle schools like Roger Williams Middle School in Providence, which was built somewhere around the 4th century by cloistered monks, and asking that just to slap on, maybe fix the water fountains too, because those are lead contaminated. I mean,
So you're saying
we're in the dark ages.
So you're saying something's wrong with the Jesuit education?
I'm not saying anything. It's just that Jesuit education might be a little more than a millennial.
Well, and that
old.
gets back to an issue which I am by no means an expert on, is how RIDE is going to distribute the money, what their criteria, what their standards are. You could spend,
But it's not enough. It's not enough. Roger Williams Middle School is a $70 million cost.
But I think we're pushing in terms of affordability, we're pushing the envelope pretty far. You know, people talked about having unmet needs of $2 billion, I think.
3.2 billion in that road.
3.2 billion, and so yes, you can only do so much with that money, and you have to start somewhere, and if the place you have to start is to make sure kids are in a decent learning environment, that's where you start. You could spend all that money in Woonsocket and Providence and possibly Pawtucket. And so I think the key thing here is, one, recognizing that we have finite resources, and number two, when you have finite resources, you have to have some confidence in the decision-making ability of the people who are distributing the money, what criteria they're gonna use, what the priorities are. And I don't know what RIDE is thinking about or doing, but watching RIDE operate, that's a fair question, a fair concern.
Let's jump over a little bit to the flip side of it, which is this was the governor's big message coming out of her State of the State. I assume, like Rhode Island Promise, it's her big initiative for 2018. She's gonna bank on this for re-election. Is it got the same wow factor if it's well, not quite $1 billion, but when you peel back the claim, it's really just 125 million.
It's closer to 300 million. If you know the 50 million that we're putting into the school building authority, and this 250 million. Does it have a wow factor? One of the problems with this governor on education is she thinks education is important, gives it a lot of support and a lot of more than just lip service support, but things aren't funded at scale. So you look at this budget, there's $260,000 for computer programs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're going to have really state-of-the-art technology,
that doesn't go very
you
far.
need more. There's $1 million. We've starved higher education in the state for a long time, and instead of giving money to institutions, there's $1 million for each of the institutions. But there's 3.6 million, additional 3.6 million for the Promise program, without worrying about what the structure is going to be to provide the services to the things kids you've made promises to. So there's a little bit all over the place. Everything in education is a priority, and it's like football. If you have 2 quarterbacks, you don't have one. And so I think there's a question of a focus on the governor's part. She's identified all the right issues in education, but I think the execution and the focus is a question. I think there's a question of the governance structure. We've talked about this before. I think there's a question, I don't hear or see a lot from the Department of Education. So there's a question of how the bureaucracy is reacting and administering these programs. And so it's easy to put a budget together, put numbers in and say we're gonna do this. You have to execute. I'm not critical of the numbers she's put in. I'm just critical of the concern of the lack of clarity in how the execution goes forward, and then not focusing enough, because P. DuPont, who was governor of Delaware, used to say this is years ago, governor can do anything he or she wants, but can't do everything. And you get the sense with the governor's education budget, if you bring up a legitimate education problem, she has a program for it.
Yeah.
But what's the follow through, what's the scope, the scale, and the size of the program?
Is it enough? Listen, you've been around the block. Is she vulnerable to the General Assembly, especially House leadership? to paring this back and then not having a wow factor and not making the impact that, from a public policy standpoint,
but that's
that she wants to make.
But the question I raised earlier today, if the legislature, in their wisdom, so we only could afford a $150 million bond issue to fix up the schools, and that's a 3-year program, you tell me the difference between a $250 million 5-year program and a $150 million 3-year program, and if it's going well and it's doing the things that we anticipate that it can do, then you could put another bond issue on the question. But you can't be blind to certain things. You can't be blind to the fact, number one, debt service takes from general revenue, and that means you can do less somewhere else. You can't be blind to the fact that there's just so much capacity people have to pay taxes, and so you have to look at tax-supported debt in relation to personal income. The standard that's used is that tax-supported debt shouldn't take more than 4% of personal income. We're already at 3.5%. So we're not at the top of the, we're getting close to the targets, and you have to recognize it. Those are real factors that have to be considered. We don't talk about our pension liability. When you look at debt and then what the ARC, the actuarially required contributions are, you find out that we're very close to our targets again. So we have pension debt, we have high debt compared to our peers. Our debt is high. For example, debt to personal income, the national average of the 50 states is about 2.5%. Moody's had ours at 3.7%.
That's significantly higher. That's 50%.
Right. You look
higher.
at debt service in relation to general revenue. The median for all 50 states is a little over 4%. I think it's about 4.3%. In Rhode Island, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's over 6%. So, it's easy to say we have to have a wow factor, we have to put more money in, but these metrics are used by rating services. They're used, been used by a number of general treasurers and the Public Finance Management Board. We're not in a position where we have to stop assuming new debt because we repay. We have a pretty rapid repayment. We retire about 76% within 10 years. National figure is much lower than that. So, but there's a management question.
Right.
The resources are finite. We talked about what can be afforded. The general treasurer said we can afford $222 million. Based on some pretty sophisticated metrics that he and the Public Finance Management Board looked at. I say, okay, I accept that number, but I have to build a more conservative. So I put a 90%, 10% cushion in there. So you back around to that number, whether it's 220 or 180 or 200. That's what we can afford, be fiscally responsible, and not have debt service run out other money that we need for operations.
Is he doing a good job?
I don't know. Don't spend that much time looking at it. I was impressed with the report that he put out on debt. It was probably the most comprehensive report on state local debt that I've seen for some time. I think stepping back from some of the investment strategies that Gina had for hedge funds and others were, wise is back to the basic program. So the jury's still out, but I think there's some promise in those two initiatives.
He was on here 2 weeks ago. Don't want to confuse him with last Friday. He was on 2 Fridays ago. Last Friday's puppies from the Puppy Bowl were on. So that was a different rhythm to those two appearances. Let's jump down to Washington. What are you crazy Republicans doing this week on debt ceiling? You've got to up the debt ceiling?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's in March after debt ceiling. But
When's that due?
That's March.
Oh,
But we ran out of money at February 8th to operate the government. So people are still trying to work out something with the Dreamers. It's too bad that, one party in Washington thinks that solving the immigration problem is more important than the fiscal security of the country. So they're going to have to get together and work those things out. But it's a very unsettling atmosphere down in Washington. The way the Intelligence Committee is handling its business with these memos, the president's unpredictability. And then hopefully the Democrat memo will come out soon, so we'll see what that looks like.
Right, we'll get them all out there.
Yeah, so it's a very unsettling time, and the concerns that a lot of us had about a Trump presidency and the unpredictability is, I think, we're beginning to see it. And so while there have been accomplishments, we've talked about this before, on judges, particularly circuit court judges, on the Supreme Court justice, on getting major tax legislation through on a lot of deregulation, on, I think, the military being not in great shape, but having a more rational command structure on the field. Those are all positive accomplishments. But at the end of the day, how is the country being governed? And that unpredictability is causing some concern.
You know, it's funny, last week he started off obviously with a state of the state that got pretty darn good reviews. Even the New York Times and the Washington Post gave him, for the most part, a tip of the hat. Polling came back, CBS had it, 75% of Americans who watched it approved of his speech.
Good speech.
But by the end of the week, the Nunez chaos in Russia, you know, based on Russia's economic stability, shouldn't we just make an Alaska-style acquisition and put it all to bed?
Well, the most difficult job in the world is being the communications director for this White House. Because, you know, he gives it was a good State of the State speech. I think everybody, you know, majority of people, you know, recognize that. He spoke really to middle America in that speech. I think it was well done. I think some of the people he had, the audience, some of the sacrifices, the number of people he had made representative of others was good. And you would hope that the first thing you would do after you did that was to get on a Greyhound bus and go to Pennsylvania and Ohio,
Yeah, right.
and barnstorm that, you know, follow up on that State of the State speech. But the communication strategy drops. He's tweeting back and forth about a memo exonerating him, and you know, I don't know if the memo wouldn't quite read it that way. And so it's unfortunate, you know. And I know one of the things that you said you want to talk about is stock market, but one of the issues that affects the correction is unpredictability in Washington. And
So Friday we are down 500. Today we are down, let me just pull it up. We are down 4.6%, 1175. So a little over 1,600 for the 2-day turn. Is that a correction, which we really haven't had in a couple of years, or is that a
we don't know yet.
Yeah.
That's a $64 question. You know, market declines.
Well, your nickname is the Money Man, so
Yeah,
you know
but-
we kind of look to you
Look,
on Mondays for
well,
some answers
This
here.
will be a confession. I have people managing my own personal situation, and they know a lot more.
But
than I
you
do.
own them.
No,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
I do what they say. It's worked out pretty well for everybody. But no, you asked the fundamental question. You know, when is it a market decline, a correction, and when is it something else? And market declines are scary. You know, people watching the market go down, what would you say, 1,600 points in a few days, is very unsettling.
But it's only what, about?
Yes, we have big
We
numbers.
were at 26,000.
Yeah,
Now 1,600.
which would
so-
be about 6-7%.
Yeah.
And I think the question is the fundamentals of the economy is such. I would begin to worry about it when the market declined by more than 10%.
Yeah.
That's my imaginary number. You know, a 10% clearly is a correction. Each 2,500 points or 2,600 points is not an insignificant number, but it is a correction. And I think the fundamentals of the economy are strong. And it's kind of ironic that the fundamentals of the economy are adversely impacting the market. We had real growth in wages.
Right.
Unemployment has stayed, stable.
And it's low.
Yeah.
I mean,
inflation is starting to, pick up a little bit.
is it that the indicators that we historically, and Mike DeBiase was here last week, if you said you had 4-point-something% unemployment and you had a stock market at 26,000 up whatever it was, 30%, 40% in less than a year, you would think you are running one heck of a surplus in a state going by the old rules. The old rules don't count much anymore.
No, because employment's different. Labor participation, there are a lot of different
Yep.
numbers you look at. Labor participation is down, quality jobs are down.
Yeah.
So there's a number of, factors. And so, are we in a correction right now, or are this portends something else? I have to look at a couple of things to try to forecast. One, there's a lot of, volatility, and investors are really worried about what's happening with the bond market. The bond market is at an all-time high, and so with the unpredictability in politics, It's easy to plant money in a less risky bonds than more risky, stocks, even though your rate of return's not, the yields.
Although I know Friday and earlier today, Amazon, while everything else was red, Amazon was still picking up steam.
Amazon is in its own world till the Justice Department finds out where they're located, then they'll come back with the rest of us. The faster, the growth rate in employment is contributing to inflation, which people are worried about. There's really a Goldilocks thing. When is it too hot or too cold? And so some things that we were concerned about higher wages, keeping unemployment, low.
Is it triggered though by the Fed inching up the?
That's part of it. Yeah. I'm not that. I can't take 10 factors and say this is 2% of it and that's 5% of it. But yeah, all this is happening at one time. So the Feds are triggering up interest. Bond prices are higher. Inflation is being impacted by wages. People are concerned that corporations' profit statements will go down as labor market tightens. They have to pay higher wages. All not necessarily bad things, but when you take them collectively, that sends some signs. And I keep on coming back to, they look, the corporations and investors, look at debt ceiling that we have to change. Look at a government that's essentially dysfunctional right now in terms of passing a budget and setting spending ceilings. The uncertainty internationally. President never quite sure what.
I don't know. Internationally, there's always flux.
This
Interest rates up is incremental.
No, there's two pieces of flux now which people don't like to talk about, both Democrat and Republicans. As a traditional conservative, I believe strongly in free trade.
Yeah.
And what's happening with China?
Yeah.
What's happening with our inability to be part of the TPP, Brexit. There are a whole number of things happening that are affecting the international economy. And
Yeah, I mean, for, London's decline, Dublin's exploding, and you couldn't get another crane in that city correspondingly.
Yeah.
I've mentioned a number of times, we were in Dublin this past summer, and there had to be 75 cranes in the sky, only to be topped by the one or two here in downtown Providence. We have 2 cranes.
See, but hey, what you have to look at is the quality of the crane.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you have cranes up there, subsidizing the building of apartment houses, those cranes will fly.
I teased Stephen Pryor one day. I said, why don't you just go to Boston, rent a bunch of cranes, and bring them down here? Take a couple TV commercials, you're all set.
Well, when I looked at the morning Consell poll, the cranes don't seem to be pushing the governor's approval.
No, the governor's got, she may have $3.3 million. One strategy she might want to take on is taking $100 and sending it to 33,000 Rhode Islanders to see if she can get them over to her side. Just jump over to that. We've just got a couple more minutes before Mr. Innovation comes on. Alan Fung, Mayor of Cranston, had a decent quarter. He didn't knock anyone's socks off, but he did 175,000. Surprisingly, who had a surprisingly good quarter in the third quarter, Patricia Morgan fell back to kind of more of what you thought she'd do, and it was around 29,000. Is she viable raising $29,000 in a quarter? I mean, that doesn't really keep much of a light on.
Well, the answer, you certainly need to raise money to get your message out, but I would say a couple of things for Patricia. She works hard.
Yep.
Every time I go to a meeting, she's there. She has a platform in the legislature. She has positions on issues.
She's tough as nails.
She talks about, those issues. And so putting that together with a small Republican, we don't know the size of the Republican primary, but an unpredictable Republican, primary, putting it together with, Trump not spending near as much money as the Clinton
Yep.
people did, and I'm not quite sure, how it's, well, what do you buy? What do you spend the money for? Now, you could spend the money for organization and person.
Organization, polling, targeting, and social media. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what you're gonna do in
You're
a
not-
direct mail, Republicans and,
But you're not gonna buy, you don't have to buy ads.
no, TVs and complete waste,
Or waste,
right.
billboards or TV or
No.
newspaper ads. So.
You gotta hit somewhere
Yeah.
between about 35,000 and the highest ever, I think, is about 60.
So I think, I think in this climate, she's a viable candidate. I think the one advantage Alan has, he's the mayor of Cranston,
Yeah.
and then that could be a big number of votes in a relatively small primary. But it's too early to rule anybody out as either viable or not viable at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the governors consistently, whether it was the Della Volpe poll in October that we commissioned, Morning Consult pretty consistently, private polls by different interest groups in Rhode Island that we've had some peaks at, she's right around 40%, 38 to about 42.
We-
It's tough to get, even with Joe Trillo in the race, if he stays in the race, it's hard to get a winning formula.
Well, there's a couple of things about the formula I think in her favor. Number one is you don't need a majority to win this race.
Correct.
You need a plurality.
Right.
And number two, there is a certain gravitas to incumbency, and so that's an important factor. Number three, I don't know if there's gonna be a primary, challenge, to her. And number four, if you have $3.5 million and you have to run your numbers up by 5 or 6%, organizationally, you have the resources
Correct.
to do that. So, I think she's still very formidable.
Yep. Oh, I think it's gonna be, could be a classic Rhode Island race. Joe Trillo, I don't see getting into double digits, but you never know.
I have a minority, I don't know what he's gonna get, and I think his event that he had the minister at this last week, my understanding of him particularly well attended, I don't know how many.
The pastor came over prior to that and was on with Kate last Friday. Between the puppy from the Puppy Bowl and Jarvis Green, the ex, was he an LSU guy? Was Jarvis Green an ex
I think
LSU
so.
guy?
I don't remember, but yeah, he was.
Yeah.
But no, so but just keep in mind that Trump had, 35-40% of the vote. The Trump vote is still very solid. There's nobody else that has 35% of the vote.
Yeah, that's right.
I think his numbers were around down to 25 or 30%. But if, Joe's able to get those people,
Yep.
Mobilized, he could get into double digits. But I said, I think the campaign that was run, not the last one, but the one before that, where if the third person that gets between, 6 and 10%, in this state, with the advantage the Democrats have in terms of registration, that's a very high
Yeah,
number.
that's a big number.
That's a big number.
Well, listen, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Congratulations on your big win last night.
I didn't win anything last night. I won 2 6-packs.
2 6-packs. We will not allow this communication. We will block the IRS from hearing about your winnings.
If I bought inexpensive beer, probably, with the new rules, it probably comes under the.
That's right. Under the new tax reform, you
Yeah.
probably put in the beer provision so you can escape that. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Great to
Good
see
be
you.
here.
All right. We'll be right back in 1 second.